Well, it's 11 o'clock on the dot, so I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Identity Theft Resource Center's 2020 Data Breach Report Review. I'm Eva Velasquez, CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center, and here with me today is our COO, James Lee. Welcome, James.
Hello, and welcome to you too.
As you all know, the ITRC has been capturing and analyzing publicly reported data breaches in the US for more than 15 years. In this 30-minute presentation, we'll do a deep dive into our analysis and key findings, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll take a look and respond at the end. This full report will be available for download tomorrow in honor of Data Privacy Day. And for those of you viewing this webinar live, you'll receive a copy of that report via email. All others, you can visit the ITRC website to download the report. And next slide. Let's get started. And here are the three topics of discussion today. First, mass data breaches and the number of individuals impacted are down, replaced by ransomware and phishing schemes. Second, stealing mass amounts of consumer information is out, accumulating logins and passwords is in. And third, funding for identity crime victim support is dropping at a time of rising identity fraud. And, as for this one, we are deeply concerned about this drop in available funding of programs that provide free services at a time when identity, cyber crimes, related frauds, they're just skyrocketing. And our concern is that if free victim and consumer services are not adequately supported, the public will be left with only paid options, and that is not a good thing. And I'm going to dig into that a bit more later. Slide 3. And now, without further ado, here's the data that you've been waiting for. And at this point, I'm going to hand it off to James here, and he's going to break this down.
Thank you, and happy Data Privacy Day Eve to everyone. So as Eva said, we've been analyzing and collecting and analyzing data breach data since 2005. So we're going to take a look back for the last several years. And you can immediately see here with these, with this particular slide and these charts, that we are seeing a continuing trend downward in terms of both the number of data breaches, and as we'll see in the next slide, also the number of individuals impacted. Now, one of the things we do at the ITRC that is different than some of the other reports you'll see is we break out a distinction between a breach, which we define as being data is exfiltrated, it's extracted from where it lives, it is stolen. Ultimately, it is misused. And we make the distinction that that's different from an exposure, because we have seen, as since 2017 in particular, we've seen this rise as people migrate to the cloud of data exposures. The data is not exfiltrated, it stays where it is. There's no indication that it has been misused, but it has been compromised. And it has been available for viewing by anyone who knew actually how to get to that data in whatever cloud attached database where it was stored. So as you'll see here in 2020, that we had 1,108 publicly reported data breaches. That's what we tracked in the year 2020. That is down from the previous years. It's down roughly 19%. But over time, it's down far more from that. Our high water mark in 2017, that's a 33%, a true third of a reduction since that time. And you'll see that we're still primarily data breaches, but there's also a number of these data exposures. When we look at this chart, what this tells us is also the number of individuals impacted is dropping as well. So in particular, if you go back to our high water mark in 2016 to this past year, the number of individuals impacted has dropped by 88%. It's a 66% drop, 2/3 from 2019 to 2020. Now we calculate this different than other organizations who report. They report number of records that were breached or compromised. We report the number of individuals impacted. Now, sometimes those are high numbers still, as you can see in 2016, and that's because you have multiple individuals impacted through multiple data breaches with multiple records each time. So you get to a higher number, but the trend overall is fewer breaches, fewer individuals impacted. And in particular, you'll see on the bottom part of this screen, if you look at the number of individuals impacted by data breaches, where data is it's exfiltrated, it's extracted from a system, versus that which is just exposed through some failure of configuration, or somebody just didn't put the password on the cloud database, you see there are actually far fewer number of events, only 107 data exposures where no data was exfiltrated, but the number of individuals impacted is higher. And why is that? That's because even though there are fewer events, the number of individuals involved in those large data events, when the cloud databases, there tends to be more people. So there's actually more people being impacted by them than by the true data breaches. Let's move on here and look at the root causes. And this is where we begin to see some significant difference from past year. I want to focus on these first two areas here. This is cyber attacks. So we break our report into three basic chunks: cyber attack, a human or system error, or a physical attack. Over time, the percentage has shifted. Once upon a time, when we first started these reports 15 years ago, physical attacks, paper, if you will, was the number one cause. It was not a cyber attack. Today, it's cyber attacks far and away. 878 of those 1,108 events are cyber related. And there are some non-secured cloud database numbers in here, but in this particular case, those cloud database issues is where data was actually extracted. But look at these first two categories where you see the mass number of that percentage. Phishing and smishing and business email compromise and ransomware. Those two together make up more than 60% of the total number of data events this past year. The interesting thing about that is none of those events require mass amounts of consumer data, and nor do they result in mass amounts of consumer data being exfiltrated and then migrated over into identity marketplaces like we have seen in the past. So if you think about what we were talking about, say even 5 years ago, we were still talking about people hoovering up mass amounts of consumer information. Any kind of data was good data, and you wanted as much of it as you humanly possibly could if you were a threat actor. Today, they've become better organized, their attacks are more sophisticated, their business processes are more sophisticated, and they are highly targeted now in the kind of data they want. They still want data, they still need data, it still involves consumers, but it is not the same kind of data at the same scale. And this number here, these two numbers here, reflect that. When we look at human and system errors, which is the next large chunk of events, 152 compared to, as we just saw, more than 800. Failure to configure cloud security. That's the top one, followed basically by some form of correspondence where you're sending information to the wrong person, and it includes some sort of personal information in that correspondence. That can be by post or by email. So let's focus on that number up at the top, failure to configure cloud security. Just this week, we've seen where Gartner has come out with its one of its predictions, which is 95% of all cloud security issues by the end of 2022 will be directly related to a failure by the customer. So the person or organization whose data is now put in the cloud, or whose software is in the cloud, their systems in the cloud, 95% of the time, if there's a security issue, it's going to be because of something they did, or in this case, did not do. So failure to configure cloud security is a significant driver of data breaches, or in this case, data compromises, where the information was never exfiltrated, but it was available for viewing. So there is risk involved. It's just not the same level of risk. Um, we'll go on to the next, which is physical attacks. Smallest category, 78 in terms of events. Also, the lowest number of individuals impacted, less than 1 million in this cases. We see these kinds of events continue to drop over time. Device theft is still the number one. That's both laptop and mobile devices. So you still see that, but because we are more aware today than we have been historically about how to keep those devices secure, you don't see as many data breaches and data events are related to that, because either the data is encrypted on the laptop has a strong security on it, or the device, if it's a mobile device, phone, whatever, even if the data is not encrypted, the phone itself is very difficult to get into. I do want to point out down here toward the bottom of that list, skimming devices. There are only 5 reported data breaches in 2020 involving a physical skimming device. Now, there are more skimming devices now in use, more kinds, I guess you would say, in use, but those are accounted for in the cyber attack, because they tend to be either virtual skimmers attached to websites, somewhere embedded in a website so we can extract that data at that point, or they are wireless devices attached to some sort of point of sale system, but that is increasingly a very small number of the root cause of a data breach. This year, when we finally see the last vestiges of mag stripes, which is pay at the pump gas pumps, they under the PCI rules, this is the year those have to shift to chip and pin like the other point of sale systems. So we expect to see this concept of skimming at point of sale to become even less of an issue. What types of data are we seeing compromised? Here you see at the highest level, clearly Social Security numbers are still very valuable. The bad guys want them. Personal health information is valuable. It's valuable in the identity marketplaces and the dark web. So you still see that as something that is a target. Email and password. Now, this is an interesting one, in that if we displayed this data in a different way, and you looked at it on a month-by-month basis as opposed to just a straight line, we would see that this was a trend line up throughout the year. As email and passwords became more important as a target for an attack, where that's what people were actually wanting when they engaged in some form of a cyber attack, you would see that going up through the course of the year. Now, why is that? That goes back to that first trend we talked about, and that is the threat actors are no longer interested in just mass amounts of whatever kind of data they can get. And there's 2 dynamics at play here. One is it's much easier to attack a business and try to engage that business in either some form of ransomware, or and those usually start with phishing, or just an outright phishing attack. You can attack one business one time and get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, as opposed to trying to go consumer by consumer by consumer by consumer, and maybe you'll get a couple of $100. I think the average, according to the FTC, is about $300. So just the sheer force of effort, the bad guys don't want to go through that onesie-twosie anymore. And that is reflected here on this chart. The popular perception is that your Social Security number is the single most valuable piece of data that you have. It is to you, it is not in the marketplace. In the identity marketplace, a Social Security number today, the average price is $4. If you go up the value chain a little bit, as you see here, a MasterCard with a PIN, $15, Amex, $35, Visa, $25. But look at what goes as you go into some of the more esoteric forms of data, if you will. Think about social media. Well, now you're talking about $75 almost for a Facebook account. Why is that? Because the information there, in the proper hands of a bad threat actor, can be used both for social engineering to maybe get into a corporate system, social engineering in the sense that you can recruit other people to come into a fraud, and you can extract their logins and passwords and their information that can be used for social engineering. And when you look at the highest level, in the common kinds of data that we're now seeing people to extract, just a Gmail account, your basic Gmail account, login and password goes for $155 in the identity marketplaces. Now, if you want to hit the mother load, you can offer up an email administrator credential, set of credentials for a corporate email system, $120,000 to start. So what that tells us is there is still risk to consumers. And one of the things that drives that risk is consumer behaviors. We don't protect our passwords because the way that we should, because we don't think they're valuable. And we don't make the connection as consumers that my personal information can be extrapolated in such a way that it can also impact my employer or my company if I happen to be the company owner. So one of the things we talk about is we have to not just continue to do the things we have done historically to keep our data secure. We have to think of new ways of defeating the behavioral type of actions that the threat actors are taking. I want to make a particular comment here about supply chain attacks. They're kind of buried in here in all this data. But there were 694 different companies, at least. There's probably more, but those that we can directly identify. There are 694 events where it was the result of a supply chain attack. And the biggest one was Blackbaud, and that's that massive spike you see there in this chart, where it's again a reflection that the bad guys are being more targeted and they're more refined and more sophisticated in their attacks. They're not going for a mass attack anymore. They're going highly targeted. Why would I go and try to hit the customers of 500 organizations at one time when I can go to one organization, I can exfiltrate their data and I can hold it hostage, and then I can get a ransom payment, and then I can go and do it to somebody else and repeat that process. You make much more money that way. In the case of Blackbaud, we know that there have been more than 500 organizations impacted by that attack. And that is a level of effort, a conservation of effort on the bad guys we haven't seen before. You know, if you're familiar with this attack, you know that they were attacked, they were notified of the ransom demand, they paid the ransom, and then the data was destroyed, according to the bad guys and the intermediary who had evidence that the actual exfiltrated information was destroyed. So the information never got out into the wild. The other thing that we're also seeing in these kinds of attacks, as you may be aware, is the fact that there is increasingly what the bad guys are extracting, along with highly targeted consumer information, is intellectual property. So you may have seen a lot of information around the SolarWinds breach at the end of the year, and that's still playing out. But by all accounts, that was not about stealing mass amounts of consumer data. That was about either intelligence gathering, good old-fashioned espionage, spy work, spycraft work, or stealing intellectual property, looking at the Microsoft source code as they did in one case. Let's talk about a few case studies to give you examples of what we've talked about in these trends. First of all, ransomware, as we talked about, that is, according to some reports, the #1 concern of CISOs this year. We certainly, our data reflects that is increasing. And there again, it's not that consumer data is the target. Consumer data gets caught up in the process. And by and large, this idea of ransomware for extortion, so pay my demands or I'll release the information, seems to be working well. Organizations are paying more and more. There were more than 550 of those kinds of events last year, according to a report out today. And so we certainly expect to see ransomware to continue into the future. That puts personal information at risk. There's not a lot that an individual can do to prevent that. You can't protect yourself against a ransomware attack, frankly, but businesses can. And the thing that the businesses always need to keep aware of, one is a frequent backup system. Make sure you're backing up your data. That's the best and fastest way to be able to recover from a ransomware attack if your data is actually being encrypted and held hostage. Patching known software flaws. This is for a wide variety of reasons. Patching those software flaws as soon as you are notified that it exists, because that, short of some form of a phishing expedition where they're able to get legitimate logins and passwords, the second most popular way of getting in for a ransomware attack is exploiting some known CVE. And then lastly, very controversial, and I will freely admit it, it would be a very tough decision for any business to make, and that is don't pay the ransom demand. A lot of people have cyber insurance. That's exactly, the bad guys know they have cyber insurance, and they know the cyber insurance companies will pay it. That may or may not continue as the insurance market hardens. We'll have to see how that affects the overall availability of cyber insurance and the premiums for that. But right now, insurance covers most ransomware attacks. Law enforcement will say, don't do it. Insurance will say, do it. At the end of the day, the business decision has to be made. You know, what is going to be best for my company, my shareholders, and my customers? Because if I can't do business, that's a very tough decision to make. And I think we all freely acknowledge that. But ransomware is going to continue to be an issue in this year, and we'll need to continue to watch that to see how that plays out. By the way, at the end of the year, the average ransomware attack was about $233,000 per demand. So we'll have to see, you know, what the annual figure for the year. Large enterprises were already paying over $1 million by the end of 2020. In 2018, when this first sort of started, this first wave we're now in, still in the first wave started, that average ransomware payment was somewhere less than $10,000. Stolen credentials. Another big issue here. This is where we are seeing the payoff for the years of the mass scale data breaches that we've seen since 2005, where again, the threat actors just hoovered up everything. They have every conceivable piece of data accessible in these identity marketplaces. And where it really came into play was this year, when they had the opportunity, because of the pandemic and because of the amount of money being pumped into the US economy by the federal government, literally trillions of dollars at one time. They had all the information they needed to impersonate as many people as they possibly wanted to be able to take advantage of those government benefits are being made available, primarily unemployment benefits. That coincided with state governments in particular, some of whom had reconstructed their IT systems to allow for central authentication. So one login for all of state government. That came into play. You had some states that didn't have an IT structure that would support just the sheer volume of applications for unemployment benefits. And so they would remove their authentication protocols. Ultimately, a lot of the organizations who had the sophisticated central authentication also removed their authentication protocols because the volume was too much. Actually, the states that have fared the best in this situation are those who had the most rudimentary unemployment benefit systems. There are still some that run on COBOL. So those of us of a certain age probably learned how to program in COBOL a long time ago. Those are the states that, oddly enough, they may have been swamped with volume, but they did not have the fraud issues the way that the other states have. Washington State, more than 500 million. Maryland, more than 500 million. California, just this week, acknowledged more than $11 billion in fraud related to this. And that's because the bad guys are able to either impersonate people who legitimately needed unemployment benefits and got there first, or they impersonated people who were still employed, and they may not even be in the state of California. They could be in multiple states. and they would impersonate them to get those benefits. Those people will not find out they're victims until they get a 1099 form from a state saying, this is how much tax you owe on your unemployment benefits. So how do you protect yourself at work and at home? Because both of these apply in both locations. Don't reuse your passwords. One unique password per account. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, if you're like the average person now who has approaching 100 different accounts that require a password, use a password manager. Upgrade to a password that's at least 12 characters long. I know a lot of IT policies still say, you have to have upper, lower, special character. It has to be reset every 30 days, whatever. If the FBI, Microsoft, most of the OEMs, if you're looking at a more current kind of password protocol, it's none of those things. Is it long and is it memorable? Because that facilitates people being able to remember that password. Multi-factor authentication, wherever you can, where it's available, use the multi-factor authenticator app. That's better than the text or the email or the phone call, because those can be spoofed in certain circumstances. But authenticator apps are offered by Google, Microsoft, others. So use that if you can. If you don't already have key online accounts for whatever reason, you want to consider setting those up. So here's the example of, because of the unemployment fraud this year, what we've learned is the bad guys will set up accounts, and it is virtually impossible then for you later to come in and say, wait, that's my account. So if you haven't set up an online account for banking, for insurance, for utilities, whatever it is, consider doing that. And then lastly, I already mentioned, use a password manager to keep track of that 100 passwords that you may have today. Last thing is unsecured databases. We've talked about this throughout. This is not tough. Put a password on your cloud database. It's not that difficult. Remember that you, as the business owner, you are responsible for the security of your data in the cloud. You are responsible for the security and the patching and the maintenance of your software in the cloud, not Microsoft, not Google, not Amazon, you. So make sure that you have the same level of robust security and protection in the cloud that you would have if the servers were still in your own server room. And Eva, I'm going to give it to you to wrap up.
Well, I think this is a great way for us to close on this, because now that we understand the scope of the problem and we've seen how complicated and how many opportunities there are for the thieves to monetize our data and our identity credentials, we have this other issue. And that is, at a time when these rates are going up, the amount of the dollars that we're putting towards helping victims and consumers is continuously going down. And look, this is personal to us. The ITRC is funded by a combination of grants, federal, corporate, and private, as well as corporate sponsorships, donations, and our fee-for-service offerings. And of course, all of those dollars, including the fee-for-service revenue, it goes right back into our primary mission of providing free victim services. And as a victim service organization, we rely on this funding, and it comes from the Victims of Crime Act, the VOCA fund. And by the way, these are not taxpayer dollars. This fund is replenished by the fines, penalties, restitution, asset forfeitures from the people who are actually committing crimes. And to give you an idea of the magnitude here, in 2019, this fund released approximately $2.3 billion in grants. In 2020, at a time when things were just exploding, that amount was reduced to about $1.8 billion. I know that may sound like a lot, but keep in mind, this is for all crime types of services and needs. And the last time there was funding that was dedicated specifically for identity crime victims, that was back in 2016. And our concern is that if we continue down this path, we could get to a point where the only choices that victims have are paid services. And the notion that only high net worth individuals or people with the disposable income and the financial ability to pay for a service, or hire an attorney, or that they would even have the understanding to recover themselves. That's just false. We know that these identity credentials, and even looking at the unemployment identity theft problem, it was really across the gamut. It doesn't matter what your true socioeconomic picture is. A lot of people are going to continue to need assistance, and we need to be putting more resources towards this problem, not less. Next slide, please, Mr. Lee. And, on that note, please get more involved and engage with us if you're able to. You can learn more about this space and these important issues by reaching out to us. You can sign up for our TMI, which stands for Too Much Information. It's a weekly email blast, and by subscribing to our podcasts. We have the weekly breach breakdown, which is hosted by Mr. Lee, where we discuss the most interesting, relevant external event that's happening in the space. And then we have the Fraudian Slip, where we take a broad look at the identity crime issue. Often we have expert guests. Last month we had Jim Robnett, the Deputy Director of Refund Crimes for the IRS. And coming up, we have Shamika Walker, the Identity Theft Program Manager with the Federal Trade Commission, where we'll be talking about Identity Theft Awareness Week, which is coming up very soon. And we're going to cover how you can reduce your risk as an individual, what resources are available to help, and what you can do to be a part of the solution to this problem that is affecting so many folks. And with that, next slide, please. We can open it up to questions. I have been seeing the questions popping up here, so I'm super glad you guys are engaged, and we have Alex Hamilton on our team helping us with those. So Alex, do we have some questions for James and I?
Yes, so we do have some questions from the crowd. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar. I think the first couple of questions we want to answer is, can you restate the funding numbers in 2019 versus 2020?
The funding numbers from the Victims of Crime Act, I can. It was 2.3 billion, that's billion with a B, in grants, and then it was approximately 1.8 billion in 2020. So, and it has been, we had a blip a couple of years ago where they released quite a bit of money to help with this problem, and then it's been slowly trending downwards again.
Great. Another question we received was 95% of causes of data breach to the cause of the customer. Do you mean the cloud service provider, right? What about consumers? What is their role in exposure?
Great question. So the 95% number means the owner of the data. So if the James company parks all of their data and software in the cloud, then 95% of the problems are going to be James's problems. They're caused by James. They're not caused by the actual, cloud host. What can consumers do in these circumstances? Unfortunately, there's not a lot they can do. It is a matter of due diligence on the front end. You should always ask the companies you're going to do business with, what are their security practices? How do you protect my data? If you're not comfortable with the answers you get back, if you don't get back any answers, you consider going somewhere else. I think we're going to see the answer to that question change a little bit over time, because we now have new privacy laws coming online. You have a privacy law in the state of New York, New York Shield, that requires cybersecurity of a certain level. New York Shield is actually fairly prescriptive, and it applies to every business, not just big businesses, every business that maintains information about residents of New York. So you'll be able to see more and learn more about how they protect data. Certainly in California, there's been a lot of in the media around the California Consumer Privacy Act, and then the new law that will go into effect in 2 years, the California Privacy Rights Act. Those are also combination privacy, cybersecurity, and identity laws. So they take all three elements of this issue and bundled up into one law, which is a new approach in the United States. those laws all give people more visibility into how their data is collected, how it's used, how it's stored, and how it's protected. So I think if we ask that question in another 2 years, I'll give you a very different answer. But today, it's all the burden rests all on the consumer to just ask the question, how are you protecting my data?
Great. Thank you, James. The next question we have is, what's the best practice for a business if paying ransom is not recommended?
Another great question. If you have proper backups, and if you have patched your software so you don't put an old bug back in, then that's the best practice. Restore using your backups, restore using updated patched software. Unfortunately, not everybody does that. So that's not always possible. In those cases, then you really are at the, if I want to recover my business, you either have to start from scratch or you have to pay the ransom and hope that they give you back. Now, when I say hope that they give you your data back, I hesitate to say that there is honor among thieves, but for the most part, we have not seen, at least in any broad way, these ransomware groups fail to unlock the data when it was encrypted, and they have not. When they said they would destroy it, there is every reason to believe that they actually did destroy whatever data they exfiltrated. Now, there's also no guarantee they won't try it again, which is an issue that a lot of people worry about. But at this point, we haven't seen any kind of broad scale where if somebody's data is taken in a ransomware attempt, that it hasn't been either returned or restored. That would destroy the whole business model. And these guys, you know, let's face it, in their eyes, they're running a legitimate business, or at least they're running it in a legitimate manner. They have call centers, they have help desks, they have margins, they have revenue growth plans, they make charitable contributions. So they are running a business, it's just not legitimate. And they know that if they ever get to the point where people don't deliver on what they promise, then that will destroy the entire ransomware model. But right now, it's a very tough thing for a business that gets hit.
Yeah. Moving on to the next question, can you rename the source that says the average person has 100 password accounts or more?
I tell you what, I don't have it right here at my fingertips, but I will get that for you. If you want to send me an email to jlee@idtheftcenter.org, I will get you that site.
Awesome. And we're taking stock of all the questions here today. And if we don't get to all of them, we will follow up with our email to our participants. So thank you for sending in all your questions. Next question. Can a consumer start adopting a personal information management solution and start to take control over their personal information, a password manager being the lowest common denominator of this?
I can jump in there
Yeah.
and broadly say, you know, could they? Yes. Is that a big ask? And do we need some intermediary goals and solutions? Yes, because look, all stakeholders have a role in this. And we've talked about where, largely this is not something that a consumer can manage, and this is more of the business responsibility. And I think that we need to have some processes and offerings that will allow consumers to take more control of that. But we also have to set our expectations about the capacity of our general users right now and set those realistically, because not everybody is an expert in this space and there's going to be a learning curve. So yes, I think we should continue to seek out those solutions that help consumers and allow them to take more control. But we also have to keep it reasonable that this is going to be a long process. And there isn't going to be a single panacea, at least not that we've seen, right, James?
No.
That is going to work in all instances and for all people, because it really is about how they engage. And that's very, very different. So that's my take on it, James.
No, I think that's right. It is very difficult for an individual consumer to do that. I also think that's kind of wrapped up in what we talked about a minute ago with the sort of the new legal structure and regulatory structure that's coming into play in a number of states, because it's giving consumers more access and a greater level of transparency that there's ever been before. And with that does come responsibility. So if I tell you how I'm using your information, how I'm collecting that and using it, and there comes with that a certain amount of responsibility to say, okay, I will now then manage my own information. So I do think that over time that becomes a little bit easier, but today it's a big lift for an individual.
Great. And just another question we have is, by any chance, do you have any data on the ransom amount asked by hackers to corporations?
Now we don't collect that per se. We kind of run across it anecdotally, but there's a number of organizations that do track that. One in particular, Coveware Security, you may be familiar with. They have been tracking this since 2018. You'll also see Checkpoint Security also tracks quite a bit, particularly at the large enterprise level. So right now, the average of all ransomware, irrespective of the size of the organization, the average is, a little over, $233,000. That's where we ended in Q4. So we haven't seen the total year number yet from anybody. Undoubtedly, the larger organizations are paying much more. We know that there are, in some, very large enterprises, they're paying literally millions of dollars. So even small organizations, we're talking about, small businesses in the, in the hundreds of employees range, they're having to pay, multiple tens of thousands to the low hundreds of thousands if they're hit with ransomware, and they are. You do see smaller organizations being hit with them.
Yeah, exactly. I guess just to wrap this up, final question we have is, do you think the trend of threat actors wanting logins and passwords rather than PII is just a blip on the radar, or more of a long-term trend?
Short answer, jury's out. Long answer, James.
Yeah. Everything old is new again, right? So today, I think this is a long-term trend, but everything is cyclical. I mean, anybody who's been in this space for any amount of time, the kinds of attacks, the attack vectors that you see, they come back. We had ransomware once upon a time, 10, 15 years ago. It didn't last very long because you didn't have the underlying infrastructure that we do today. But now it's back. You didn't see other forms of attack that we now see coming back into vogue. So I think, there's always ebb and flow in this world of what the bad guys, how they do things. It's pick your analogy. We always used to say when I was in cybersecurity that whenever the Oracle critical patch update came out, it was like the starter's gun. It was a race to see now who can get to exploit those vulnerabilities. The defenders, who now have to go and patch their systems, which sometimes can take up to a year, or the attackers, who have automated tools that they just load in those software bugs and just start hammering the internet looking for websites and web applications that have the vulnerability, which they can then find in hours. So this is another dynamic that we're going to see. We will find a way to defeat or at least mitigate a lot of these issues that we've talked about today. the bad guys will find a way to defeat what we just created, and it just starts all over again. So, you know, the real question is, what do we do to now respond to what we're seeing as the ability of the bad guys to exploit bad behavior? You know, not having a right password kind of set up, not having, you know, good firewalls both at work and at home now, making sure that your software at work and at home is patched properly. So we've got to look at those behaviors, and that will mitigate this current round. And then there'll be something else come up, and we'll figure out how to defeat that too.
Well, and just to piggyback on the close, you know, the threat actors will need to refresh their data at some point. And I know that sometimes when we're in this space and we get into the weeds, we tend to have a bit of a fatalistic view that, well, and I've heard this said many, many times, the data's all in the wild. I don't know. We're trying to close the, you know, the barn door after the horse is out. And while I can understand that sentiment, I think we have to remember that we have new individuals, you know, coming into the world every day, and that even if we can't do this for ourselves, we do need to think about future generations. Their data has not all been compromised. Their data is not out in the wild. And so that the things that we do now, the things that we develop, the policies, the practices that we engage in, while we can't close the barn door after the horses got out, we're going to get some new horses. So let's keep that in mind when we're thinking about the solutions to this problem. And, you know, on that note, I think we want to be respectful of everyone's time and go ahead and wrap up. If we didn't get to the questions through this Q&A, we absolutely will reach out to you individually and we'll respond to those questions. And I just want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And thank you to the ITRC team, James and Alex, for being here and sharing your thoughts and your wisdom about this data and this report. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.